So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I wanted to explain my name. I'm originally a British European civil servant, and in recent years that's been slightly uncomfortable. So I initially looked to my father, who told me that he was his family was originally from Cork, and unfortunately Fergus from Cork was just one generation too far back for an Irish passport. So I would have been very much one of you, but I'm only one of you as a European today. Luckily I had a plan B, and I'm married to a Spaniard. So for the rest of the day, please call me Pedro. So I would like to, some key messages. As a regulator, we see a critical role for ethics bodies and ethics in research right across the life cycle of medicinal products. I think, and this mirrors a comment from Dirk, we share a common goal, and that common goal is great clinical research, and obviously great clinical research done in an ethical way. EMA is committed to active collaboration with ethics bodies as key partners in improving clinical research in the EU, and we're committed to optimizing the processes for ethics involvement, including through your favorite topic, the Clinical Trials Regulation, and a project that we're sponsoring called Clinical Trials Regulation Collaborate, which I'll go into in a very little bit of detail. A couple of slides on clinical research in general, and this, if you like, is why we think we need to invest in making clinical research better. So firstly, what are the drivers for change? Well, if you just look at the bullet points on the left-hand side. There's been a relative fall in clinical trials conducted and clinical trial results that are impactful from the European Union. When I say relative, it's relative particularly to the United States, where there's been a big increase in clinical trials conducted over recent years. There is a continued slow speed and high cost of product development, so getting new innovative treatments to patients. There's a significant remaining burden in terms of unmet medical need. We have opportunities from greater healthcare data access. I'm not sure Ireland is the gold star in terms of access to healthcare data, but certainly across the European Union, there are many examples of outstanding healthcare data that can be now used to enrich clinical research. We have an opportunity from better study methods, and I think there are lots of methodologists and biostatisticians in the audience today. We have an opportunity from advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, etc. And I think the last point is important. It's been touched on in previous presentations. The pandemic has shown us that there are new and better ways of working, and we should leverage that. Again, maybe focus on the bullet points rather than the visual to save time. But this is, if you like, a vision from the European Regulatory Network for better clinical evidence in 2030. And if I go straight to the strapline at the bottom, we believe that at the core of a successful marketing authorization dossier, so licensing dossier, is excellent clinical evidence, and that's what we're trying to support. So evidence generation should be planned and guided by data, knowledge, and expertise. Now that's really, really important. So often in the past, a pharmaceutical company, or an academic for that matter, but let's focus on the pharmaceutical companies, has started developing a medicinal product without being fully informed of the whole body of research that's gone on before. And there are multiple reasons for that. Largely access to data, access to information, access to knowledge. And so we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that when a company is designing the clinical trials and the development program for its product, it is informed by all that has gone before. We think that the research question should drive the evidence choice, and this should embrace the spectrum of data and methods. My background includes, and my current responsibilities include healthcare data as well as clinical trials. So I'm quite well placed to see that they complement. But I shouldn't say that. The world is a very tribal world, and you have people that have spent their entire careers doing clinical trials who almost try and undermine and attack observational research because it's not their bit of research, if you like. There's no doubt that clinical trials remain the gold standard for demonstrating efficacy of new treatment, but there's lots of things a clinical trial can't do. It can't tell you how a medicine is used in the anarchy of clinical practice, and for that you need observational research. I just give that as one example. So the research question should drive the study methods and the choice of data. So I've preempted the next 2 points, but clinical trials remain the core, but need to be better, faster, and smarter. I sometimes write bigger in there, but then sometimes the pharmaceutical industry companies don't like that. And particularly for rare diseases, maybe bigger isn't always possible, but bigger is usually better, actually, when it comes to clinical trials. Real-world evidence should be enabled and its value should be established. And I could go into a whole talk on that, but what does enabled mean? It means accessing data, having better study methods for doing observational research, and value established. Well, let's not just assume that an observational study is good enough to make a judgment on the benefits and risks of a medicine. Let's demonstrate it through pilots. I think that's what we're saying. The patient voice should guide every step of the way. Healthcare systems should be supported in their choices. So if we're designing clinical trials or an R&D pathway for a product, let's think not just about the licensing, the authorization of the product, but let's think then about the information needs, knowledge needs of health technology assessment and payers as well. And ideally, we have one development pathway that meets all of those decision makers' needs. And finally, high levels of transparency will underpin societal trust. Speeding up a little bit, some principles to deliver this. Firstly, we need to acknowledge the problem we face, and I'll come back to that in terms of clinical research in Europe. We should be guided by patients and ethics. We should plan and replan drug development. We should travel together with stakeholders, so co-designing and co-building a better research infrastructure. We should harness the resources we need. So if we need people, let's get people, let's train them, let's get budget, let's demand budget. Let's get the data, let's get the technology, let's get the knowledge. And then we should also have a global perspective, and I think EU is well placed to be a leader in terms of better research and clinical evidence. And let's remain focused on the benefits for research, benefits for patients. And what are those benefits? Well, if we can do this well, we'll bring better medicines to patients faster. We'll increase the efficiency and effectiveness of R&D. We'll energize the EU as a centre for clinical research. We'll engage and empower patients, and ultimately we'll enable better decision-making on the benefits and risks and optimal use of products. We believe, therefore, that excellent clinical evidence brings medicines to patients faster. Now, let's get into our favourite topic, the clinical trials regulation. So I'm not going to go into a detailed lecture on the clinical trials regulation, but let's just remember what it's trying to do. Go back to before the clinical trials directive, it was every member state for itself. With the clinical trials directive, it tried to have a certain convergence. The aim was harmonisation, but it was only really convergence of rules between the different national systems. But with the clinical trials regulation that applied as of the 31st of January 22, you have one application through one IT system for any clinical trial on medicines in the European Union. And so, actually, maybe just a little reflection. If you are doing a clinical trial just in one member state, maybe the new administration and the new IT system is only a burden. But if you're trying to do a clinical trial in more than one member state, once this is running more smoothly, it should help enormously. So I just want to mention CETIS, managerially responsible for CETIS. So if anybody wants to come and kick me in the coffee break, I'm your guy. It has been an extremely painful journey, and we understand that from a user perspective, back in particularly at the beginning of 2022, it was not good enough. And we understand that, and we are working very hard with the member states, with the users, to make that better. And it is getting better. Day by day, week by week, month by month, and we haven't finished improving it. It will be better and better and better, I promise you. What is it? It is in a way. It's what was I can't remember. Somebody gave me a beautiful word in German yesterday for something that tries to do everything, and that's partly why it's been a bit problematic, because it's a single submission portal. It's a workspace for the sponsors, but also for the regulators and ethics bodies, and it's a public registry. And when it was designed nearly 10 years ago, the people that designed it were the people working in the clinical trials offices in the different member states, and they wanted to kind of replicate all of the intricacies of how you do it in Germany and Austria and Ireland and whatever. And as a result, it's a very complex system, over complex. And one of my ambitions for next year is driving a radical simplification process of the business rules, so then we can have a simpler and easier to use system coming out of it. So it won't do all of those intricacies that each of those member state designers asked for. Anyway, I just wanted to make the point and to acknowledge it's been difficult, and it continues to be far from perfect, but it is getting better. So a little bit of history. It went live on 31st of January 2022. We had the first year of transition when sponsors could choose to continue to submit outside the clinical trials regulation. We had over 500 initial clinical trial applications through CTIS, 201 authorised, and as I've reflected, there was intensive collaboration to make the system better. Which has paid some results. The majority of clinical trial applications now are going through without problems. Majority, not all. Some still require some intensive care. In the beginning of 2023, the use of CTIS became mandatory for all new clinical trial applications, and in 23, we've had increasing numbers. We're supporting 14,000 users of the system. This is quite nice, perhaps the number. So over 1,600 clinical trials have now basically been authorised through the clinical trials regulation since it started to operate. And if you look at the numbers, it's over 200, maybe 250 clinical trial authorizations per month. This is about the same as we were being authorized under the Clinical Trials Directive. It's difficult to compare like with like because of the way the things are categorized, but it's about the same as under the directive. I emphasize that because there was concern that the pain of the transition to the clinical trials regulation and the change management of embracing a new IT system might lead to a significant reduction in clinical trials being approved, and that doesn't appear to be the case, although that doesn't mean it hasn't been painful. Now, moving on from IT systems and pain to what we're trying to do more generally to support the clinical trials environment in the European Union. And our vehicle for doing it is called Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, or ACT-EU. This, for the first time, brings together the European Commission, the heads of all the national medicines agencies, and the European Commission. And that's quite significant because historically, clinical trials are member state business. You know, EMA, keep out of clinical trials, please. And in reality, it's more complex than that. Certain responsibilities are at the Commission, certain responsibilities are for EMA, particularly helping companies design their R&D programs. That's an EMA responsibility largely, and then the approval of individual clinical trials, which is a member state competence. But by bringing all of those regulatory parties together with one common aim, we believe we can make a step change in terms of the clinical trial environment. So what's the problem statement? There is a need for more impactful multi-state trials to drive decision-making. We need an overarching strategy, a joined-up strategy to bring stakeholders together. There are multiple actors requiring clear roles and responsibilities. But we can build on a strong healthcare and research infrastructure in the EU. And the vision, I won't go through the bullet points in the interest of time, but basically it is better, faster and smarter clinical trials in Europe. Why do I keep emphasizing the size of a clinical trial? Well, this is just to give you an idea. If you look at commercial clinical trials in the European Union, so pharmaceutical company-sponsored clinical trials, the average is 3 member states per trial. If you look at academic clinical trials, it's basically mononational. Okay, obviously there are exceptions, which is why it's 1.2 member states. But what does that mean? It means that a lot of academic clinical studies are small, and small clinical studies are likely to be underpowered to drive a change in decision-making or getting to a product to market. The COVID-19 experience has strongly reinforced this message. I always forget the statistic, but the vast majority of the thousands of clinical trials initiated for COVID-19 were underpowered or not designed adequately to lead to a result that could impact on decision-making. And that's not good enough. It's not good enough. So what is Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU going to try and do? This is just a few examples. There's a big program of work, but I'll just give you a few examples. Firstly, we are going to support the implementation of the clinical trials regulation. We're going to be measuring with key performance indicators, number of trials, where they're done, how long it takes, etc. We're going to survey sponsors to find out what the problems are and try and iron out those problems with the clinical trials regulation. And we will support increased transparency. We will provide specific support to non-commercial sponsors. A program will be announced in 2024 of how we will do that, and it'll almost certainly be multi-layered, and we're working with DG Research at the Commission, so that's the funding part of the Commission, as well as the regulatory part, which is more us. So watch this space if you're an academic sponsor. We will be setting up, and I've got a couple of slides on a so-called multi-stakeholder platform. The idea is to bring all stakeholders, particularly anchored in the patient, together so that we can co-design and co-build better clinical trials environment together. We want to coordinate scientific advice. Now, scientific advice, when I use that term, is when a pharmaceutical company comes to EMA and says, I'm trying to develop this treatment for disease X. This is the clinical trial I'm considering. Do you think it's likely to generate the kind of evidence that you need to for us to put the product on the market? In other words, to get a marketing authorization, a license. That's the scientific advice. In addition, you have member states advising sometimes at a national level, and in addition, you have pre-clinical trial application advice, so more on the regulatory aspects of an application. And this has historically all been done by different people, and sometimes it's contradicted. It's a bit like having multiple regional ethics bodies giving slightly different opinions. And what we're trying to do, and we're going to be launching a pilot, hopefully in the first quarter next year, is have a coordinated scientific advice process. So a company comes with a set of questions, and then they get a combined answer across the regulatory, the scientific, etc. And finally, there's a program of work which is coming out of the lessons learned from COVID-19, particularly how can we get clinical trials started in weeks rather than months. There was an interesting example, actually not from COVID-19, but the monkeypox study, and I think some in the room might have been involved, where the regulatory part, so the part one of the clinical trial application was resolved, was assessed, and a kind of pre-decision made within a couple of weeks. But the ethics part took months and months and months. And so we need to work because, basically the monkeypox epidemic was over before the clinical trial could start. So I'll spare you that slide. It's in the deck, and I'm sure they're going to be distributed. Just a little bit more on the multi-stakeholder platform. So what is a multi-stakeholder platform? This is a platform within this Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, or ACT-EU. Essentially, it is a series of ongoing topic-focused, so topic-specific workshops where we will ensure that the full spectrum of stakeholders is invited. A number of engagement tools like consultations and surveys, and then an advisory group. And importantly, there will be 2 seats specifically for ethics experts on that advisory group. And the advisory group will be advising us both on what are the concerns of stakeholders, but also on how to target the right stakeholders for the topic-specific workshops. So the kick-off meeting will almost certainly be in January, February next year. We've just closed the call for expressions of interest in membership. I haven't seen the outcome of that call yet. Very quickly, because I think we're nearly out of time, a couple of projects which are specifically to help ethics. So there's a project which is led by the Clinical Trials Coordination Group. This is the regulatory parties on clinical trials, 1 seat per member state. And it actually doesn't have a formal legal basis, but it is the operational machine of the clinical trials regulation, if you like. It's the regulators coming together and coming up with guidance, trying to solve problems. And they also have a weekly meeting of their assessors looking at specific dossiers which are causing challenges. So this Clinical Trials Coordination Group, or CTCG, is initiating a project called CTR Collaborate. They have liaisons with ethics bodies at European level. And the point there is to help at an individual national level, the regulators collaborate with the ethics bodies. Dirk said at the beginning it's different in every member state, and it is different in every member state on the ethics side. But we need to find ways of helping the regulators work in a seamless way with their ethics bodies. And the outcome of this project essentially is sort of good practices and toolboxes, that kind of thing, for work at national level. Now, to complement that, there is going to be the creation of an EU-level ethics group in the context of the clinical trials regulation. The Commission will be hosting it, the European Commission, DG Sante, and watch this space because I'm sure they will be looking for representation from all member states. Just going off on a tangent for a second, obviously we're focusing on clinical trials largely, but I have the pleasure of being the co-chair of the Big Data Steering Group, as it's called. So this is anything to do with data in medicines regulation, and we are just reinforcing our steering group with the appointment of 2 ethics representatives because it was clearly a gap in terms of us formulating our plans and guidelines and so on. The future is challenging, exciting, and I won't go through the bullet points, but I just wanted to make the commitment. EMA is committed to engaging proactively in collaboration with the ethics bodies to address the challenges and the great opportunities that we have in clinical evidence. I won't read through the slide, but there's lots going on in 2024. Please engage, workshops, consultations, draft guidelines to keep us all from having a time off at the weekends. And maybe just to come back to my key messages, we recognise as regulators the critical role of ethics bodies, not just in clinical trials, but throughout the work of medicines regulation, and we need to reinforce that. We share a common goal, and that's been my central theme, to improve clinical research in Europe. EMA is committed to active collaboration, and we're committed to optimising the processes for ethics involvement, particularly through the clinical, relating to the clinical trials regulation. Thank you very much indeed.